I don't know how this ended up being one of the most difficult videos I have ever made. I have some hypotheses, we're gonna get to those, but anyway, hi, how's it going? Welcome to my channel. Hello, my dears, that's what I normally say. I'm sorry, I'm discombobulated this morning. Video description for those who need it, to get that out of the way. I am a white person with like chin length, just above shoulder length, I don't know, curly, light brown hair. I'm wearing a red button-up shirt that has squirrels on it, and I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves on it, and great. So I have this series and it's called Your Psych and Bioprofs Lie to You, something similar to that, and I'll link it above over here. Or basically in it I debunk a lot of popular science understandings of things, a lot of pop psychology, that kind of stuff. So we've talked about like the chemical imbalance myth and the history of eugenics and the DSM, Freud, how dopamine doesn't work the way we think it does, lots of fun stuff. And after my dopamine video, I had planned to make it like a series. I wanted to do a video about serotonin, potentially vitamins like vitamin D and vitamin E and that whole situation, and also the cult of trauma. Which is like how everything, we attribute every single human trait to trauma responses that we cannot control. And since I have been talking about the differences of what trauma looks like for different generations in relation to the history that we've lived through with teachers lately while discussing integrative accessible education, I decided why not make the next one in the series about trauma. This should be pretty easy since I've been working on these concepts a lot for a while and talking about them a lot while teaching people. But then I started to research discussions around the use of the word trauma, and I have not seen this much like anger and vitriol from all sides of the equation about a concept basically since researching like applied behavior analysis forever ago. And I know what I'm about to say seems really anecdotal to the context of the video, but it is intrinsically tied to it, so stay with me. So whenever I research scientific concepts, particularly in the realm of neuroscience or psychology, I always keep in the back of my mind a class that I took in the spring of my junior year of college, and it was called Pioneers in Neuroscience or something similar, I don't remember. Something like that. And we did case studies on specific neuroscientists that were pioneering the field and like pushing the field forward. We studied like 3 or 4, but then we had a couple other that we talked about in between. Now the first scientist that we studied, who I will leave unnamed for her sake, we spent like 3 weeks-ish reading her book, which had some clinical language in it, but was fairly conversational, fairly easy to understand, as well as reading and analyzing her published research alongside that. And this stuff was hard. It was complicated. It used a lot of terms we didn't understand. We all really struggled and felt very defeated that we couldn't understand her work. We were like, oh my gosh, we're bad scientists. We're so stupid that we don't understand this. But then at the same time, we were also like really glad that we had her book that was simplifying that research to kind of bounce off of. And then after about 3 weeks, we walked into class and we sat down and our professor was like, okay, so tell me what sort of red flags you're seeing. And we were like, red flags? What do you mean by that? And then she walked us through slowly tearing apart this woman's research. Turns out a lot of the things she was saying would definitively fix something on humans was related to research she'd done that was unrelated to that concept on mice. Turned out that in her research, her sample size was maybe 4 to 5 mice on average. It was never larger than that. Turns out she'd been leaning more on her lived experience of what she thought she saw in patients rather than what actually clinically based in research seemed to have been happening. And we all missed all of that. And the way that she presented her research showed serious like promise for helping with tons of major issues that we don't have solutions for yet. And like, sure, the research itself was very confusing, but we're just students, we're just too uneducated to get it, and that kind of stuff, rather than like, oh no, this is super convoluted and she is extrapolating wildly from it to make wild claims. And this felt like we'd been slapped in the face. Also, side note, if you want to know how to spot inconsistencies in research, I did turn what I learned in that class into a video, which is in the playlist I linked earlier about how to read research critically. You should check it out. But anyway, the next neuroscientist that we studied after this, which was the same situation, we read his book, we analyzed his research alongside it, we were all like on high alert. And in his book, he used clinical language where needed, but he also explained what it meant and how it was used, so you could actually follow every piece of what was going on. His research was also fairly clear, fairly easy to follow, and the immediate results of his research were what he talked about in the book. He didn't extrapolate it to any other situations, and he acknowledged where more work and research needed to be done. And that's when I learned how to look for bias in supposedly objective clinical writing. Now, when reading sources for this video, it felt like almost every single source I read had an ulterior motive, like the first woman that we studied about in that class. My red flags were going off. Like, no matter what I read, no matter which direction of this argument it argued, it felt distinctly like reading that woman's book again. Lots of extensive extrapolation from a teeny tiny example that may not be based in reality, a lot of either a misunderstanding of what's going on or a willful misrepresentation of what's going on to prove a point, and a constant need for each side to aggressively debunk the other side as much as humanly possible, which led to an infuriating amount of cherry-picked data and quotes left out of context. It made me want to tear my hair out because can we please act like adults? I know academia is very petty and hubristic and all of that stuff, but the way that people are trying to tear each other down is making it very hard to find any actual definitive answers on anything, which is very frustrating. And I spent a lot of time while trying to research for this also trying to think about like human nature and why is this happening with this topic in particular. And I think I've narrowed it down to two primary things. The first is that when it comes to trauma, there is a fundamental disconnect between clinicians who see tons of patients every single day, researchers and professionals and whatnot who are primarily discussing theory and or patients they worked with many decades ago, and then the personal lived experiences of the general public, many of whom have been fundamentally let down by the system and also may not necessarily know the psychological neuroscience, all of that kind of stuff. And then if you add a heavy dose of internalized ableism, internalized Satanism, and some people's love and worship the DSM while others complete disavowal of it, generational divides, you have what could be, referred to technically as a hot mess. And then each group of person thinks they're the definitive group that has their feet on the ground in the field and can really understand what's going on and needs to tell everybody else what's actually going on because they're the ones who get it. When in actuality, all of the groups are missing fundamental pieces of the puzzle because nobody's communicating effectively with each other. Because the theory and science of a thing and the lived experience of a thing can be and are very different. And also these things change significantly over time as cultures and research change. The second thing is that when it comes to trauma, people get very, very defensive for obvious reasons. Trauma as a concept involves things like vulnerability and guilt and embarrassment and shame and all of these icky, not so nice feelings. And a very common experience around trauma is having people tell you that it's not that bad and you need to get over it. And if you do this, this, and this, you'll just fix it and you're not trying hard enough. And the fact that it's affecting your life is a you issue and you need to fix it. And it's also your fault that it happened to you, all of that kind of stuff. So when anybody says anything about trauma in regards to treatment or experience or science or anything else that we may disagree with, that may feel like it's invalidating our experiences around like the number one invalidated experience. Everybody gets really heated very quickly because it does feel very deeply personal and scary and bad because that's the only way I can describe the behavior that I'm seeing. Like, it's just a lot of lashing out because of personal frustrations, whether that's because of personal lived experience or how people close to them have been treated. And none of that is wrong. Like, everything that I read, I agreed with some parts and vehemently disagreed with other parts and also felt frustrated and disheartened and all of the above. And also, ironically, the angry comments on various posts and whatnot were often where I found the most wisdom. And it feels kind of like everybody wants to help with an issue that we all acknowledge is pervasive, but nobody has all the information to be able to properly help it, and so everybody's just angry. Anyway, I think in reading a lot from both sides and then perusing the comment sections in between, I feel like I have a general understanding of what through lines we can get across the board on the topic from each group, and we're gonna try to talk about all those all together. But please take this video with a grain of salt, more of a start of a conversation, some things to ponder where you stand and what you think about this topic. I found in reading all of this stuff and discovering what made me feel seen, what made me feel frustrated, that I sort of started to wade my way through my own thoughts on the topic and figure out where I stand on the matter, which is in a lot of different places, so I hope that this becomes that for you. Starting conversation. That's what we're here for. That's what I love to do. Now anyway, that was a massively long intro, so forgive me, but I do feel like that aspect of this is just as important, and I also think it uncovers something societally about how we still have a lot more mental health stigma than we like to pretend that we do, and I think it definitely uncovers other things about society as well, but I'm not quite sure what, so maybe we'll see if that formulates itself throughout the video. I'm still mulling that over. It was just really bizarre. But let's talk about trauma. Woo! Content warning, obviously. I'm gonna keep my trauma examples very, like, simple and minimal, but, you know. Okay, so step one. What is trauma? It began its life as the Greek word for wound, referring to physical injury. When used in a mental health context, it typically refers to an event that involves significant fear of safety for your life or the life of another person, such as an attack, assault, car crash, natural disaster, severe illness, etc. Asterisk. We'll get to the asterisk later. Also, generally, like, trauma does not have a fixed definition. It is super specific to individual experience. That's asterisk number 2. We're also going to get to that. Another way to look at trauma is an event that changes the nervous system and the way that we view ourselves, our relationships, or some other key aspect of life. Typically, these events are the ones that make your body feel like it's in significant danger and responds with trauma responses, which are categorized as fight, flight, freeze, fawn. If you want to learn about what those are and how they look like, I made a video on autism and trauma forever ago that's really basic. I'll link it up above. It pretty much holds up to now, actually, so that's cool. You can also just give it a quick Google. There's a lot of diagrams and stuff that you can read. Anyway, if I understand correctly, the first time that trauma was defined in any important way in the sense of mental health was in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, aka the DSM, in order to classify what counted as post-traumatic stress disorder. And since every single source I looked at either heralded the DSM as some sort of Bible or tried to avoid referencing it as much as possible, I pulled up every single DSM, because they're all free PDFs online, to figure out what the classification of trauma is and how it has changed over time, because I wanted to know. So, the DSM-1 and the DSM-2, which came out in 1952 and 1968 respectively, the word trauma was only used to describe brain trauma, as in like physical brain injury. The first time we see trauma used in another context is with the addition of the PTSD diagnosis in the DSM-3, which was published in 1980. We saw a major shift in discussions of trauma and PTSD as a direct result of the Vietnam War, which is why PTSD ended up in the DSM-3. In the DSM-3, the traumatic event was meant to be one primary thing. It could take place over a short period of time consistently, such as like you're tore in combat. I don't know how military words work, I'm sorry. But it was one specific thing, like the examples listed above, and generally outside the range of such common experiences as simple bereavement, chronic illness, business losses, or marital conflict. The DSM-4, published in 1994, is effectively the same as that one. Over time, though, clinicians started to notice that there were people who clearly had PTSD that was not from a single event, but a collection of smaller things instead, and so we then see an expansion of the term in the DSM-5, printed in 2013, which references repeated exposure to upsetting things, such as like police officers repeatedly having to learn about abuse cases, or EMTs dealing with particularly awful things, and it does explicitly exclude traumatic imagery seen through electronic media, television, movies, or pictures unless explicitly work-related, which I think is interesting because like September 11th was primarily just seen through TV. Anyway, it also somewhat implies that it is possible for several events to be the PTSD trigger rather than it having to have to be just one isolated incident or isolated period of time, because they added an S in parentheses after every mention of the word event throughout the text. In the DSM-5 TR, which came out in 2022, it is effectively identical to the DSM in this section, so great. The thing that I think is important to note here, however, which is kind of implicit when you're on my channel, but still to say it out loud, obviously the DSM definition of what counts as trauma is not the end-all be-all of situations. The primary reason being that like clinicians noticed people were getting what was clearly PTSD from a different kind of trigger, and they later changed the literature to reflect that. Psychology and diagnostics are still comparatively very new and ever-changing, and there's a lot of space for nuance, and also the DSM is a fundamentally flawed document built on systems of oppression that we've spoken about a good deal before. So there is that. Anyway, some clinicians in the trauma discussion argue that we have had too much concept creep for the word trauma, saying that now too many things count as trauma that aren't actually traumatic, which is diluting the terminology and making it less helpful. We'll get into that mess later. Now, when it comes to defining trauma, we talk about how a traumatic event is one that puts you into full fight or flight and makes you genuinely concerned about you or a nearby person's safety, which then changes our nervous systems and how we view the world. And that genuinely encompasses so many things for so many different people. For example, for a person of color, getting pulled over by a police officer could be a traumatic event, when for a white person it may just be a mere inconvenience, right? We also talk a lot about big T versus little t trauma, where the big T trauma would be like the things we talked about earlier, like the natural disasters, the plane crashes, all that stuff, the early DSM qualifying traumas, and then the little t traumas are smaller things, and I put that in air quotes, that over time accumulate to feel like massive things, like continuously losing friends, or having someone constantly comment on what you eat, or discovering that a celebrity you felt a kinship to is actually a terrible person. That happening over and over again can make you feel like everybody in the world is two-faced and it's impossible to trust people fully, and these things do mess with our nervous systems and our views of the world and can cause long-term damage as well. Another example would be the trauma of structural violence and systemic discrimination. Now, in researching, I found that many clinicians talking about the issue of this so-called cult of trauma when discussing the dilution of the term were not referring to an insensitive college student joking that a gross clogged toilet was traumatizing as being the issue, but rather the overall classification of little t traumas as actually counting as trauma as being the issue, which I fundamentally disagree with. One idea I specifically saw discussed was that like, oh, a human body doesn't actually go into fight or flight over insert smaller thing, so therefore it's not actually traumatizing. But that's like a massive generalization, right? Like, and also I would argue some semblance of a state of privilege, because the brain is fundamentally wired to protect us from danger, and each brain considers different things to be dangerous. Like, to somebody who, I don't know, got hit every time they ate candy when they grew up, being handed a chocolate bar might cause them to go into fight or flight. But then, I guess that brings us into the question, right, of what thing counts as traumatic, like what thing counts as the traumatic event, and what is the trauma response to that event, which I think is where I'm tripping myself up here, because I think everybody would agree that being continuously hit is traumatic, and the event of being handed that chocolate bar was a trigger to that set off a conditioned and learned trauma response to the traumatic event. Hopefully that makes sense, but like, would that make the event of being handed the chocolate bar also trauma? I think I would argue yes. I think I would argue yes, because like, if this happened at, I don't know, a sleepover, and like the kid started to panic about the chocolate bar, and then their friends didn't understand what was going on and they teased the kid or were terrible to the kid or something because of it, that would also be traumatic. But this is very complicated, again, because we don't have a super solid definition of trauma, or a trauma rather. Like, if we lump together anything that puts you in fight or flight into one category that includes both trauma and trauma response, it would definitely fit in that category, but which of the two? That's where it gets messy, especially because being thrown into fight or flight can be in and of itself a traumatizing experience. Like, I have a dysautonomic disorder called POTS, which means that basically my nervous system works a little funky. It's a good time. And a big fact of that is that, especially when I was younger, it would just sometimes decide to activate panic attacks. When there was nothing to panic about, it would just, my heart would start beating funky and my body would be like, okay, this is what we're doing now, which is very traumatizing because you're like, oh, I'm panicking. Is there something to be panicking about? What in my environment is making me panic? Oh my gosh, and then you start panicking about not understanding what you're panicking about. And also, another dysautonomic disorder is long COVID. So I do wonder how this diagnostic discussion might further change over time as more people are getting diagnosed with long COVID after having COVID. So I'm starting to wonder if maybe like the disconnect between trauma on the clinical end and on the more societal lens is that we're looking at things that are triggering trauma responses as being traumas themselves, and they can be both things at once, but it's also hard to know which is which in the moment, especially since in regards to a diagnosis of PTSD, it is more diagnosed by the mental recurrence and a feeling of a sort of inescapability surrounding the traumatic event. I'm not explaining that perfectly, the DSM definition of it, obviously, because we're not going to sit through and read through a whole checklist of symptoms, but you get the general idea. I love videos where I like go into it trying to explain things to you guys, and then I begin to parse through the ideas myself and come to new conclusions. It feels like I'm bringing you on a little research journey with me. It's a fun time. Now, a lot of these discussions and controversies about the nature of trauma center around a famous book you may have heard of titled The Body Keeps the Score, that was published in 2014 by trauma expert Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. Hopefully I pronounced that right. I looked it up and I forgot it. He worked clinically with trauma patients for a very, very long time. And this book was intended to make aspects of trauma care and discussions of how trauma affects the body more digestible to other clinicians, and then ended up semi-accidentally becoming a major bestseller. Now, I don't know if I 150% buy that that's what the intention was, given how well it did and the discussions of lack of academic rigor in this text, but that is what I have heard, that is what I have read as to what happened with the situation. It is really funny because a lot of people will complain that this book is too clinical, and then a lot of other people will be like, actually it's not really clinical enough, it tends to bend science for its own storyline, and extrapolates small data to say this means this, this, and this for all of humanity forever, and at times feels almost self-aggrandizing. Almost like another book that we've talked about in this video. Anyway, moving on. So, this book is very controversial, in case you can't tell. Full disclosure, I've not read it. I do not intend to. I know that I make a lot of weird literary sacrifices for this channel, but I have heard from all directions that this book is deeply re-traumatizing to many people and is explicitly not recommended for people struggling with PTSD, particularly around SA. And while a lot of readers do swear by it because it turned on a lot of light bulbs for them and helped give them the words for what they experienced and helped remove some of the shame around that for them, that's awesome, that's amazing, that's so, so important, I'm so happy for them. For me, I'm in a space where I know what happened to me and I'm handling it just fine, and as much as I am dedicated to this here craft of making you video essays, deliberately disrupting my mental well-being for an extended period of time, which then puts my physical well-being at serious risk, is not something that I'm willing to do. I have researched many hard things that are important for me to know about, such as the history of institutions or the conservatorships video from whenever that was, but this is not one of those things, so I'm setting a boundary there. I'm not doing this. Sorry. So everything that I have here is gleaned from reviews and discussions on it and lots of articles from it, and I spoke to a couple people who had read it, simply for the sake of this is an important stepping stone in the cultural conversation around trauma. It's not meant to be like a book review, so great, awesome. Now the primary critique, other than the potential pseudoscientific treatments and things discussed, is the idea that the body remembers trauma that the brain forgot. Because on one side, we have the you can't forget about memories that were traumatic. A huge part of trauma as a concept is that your brain replays it over and over and over again to figure out what happened so it can make a plan for handling it better next time, so you can't just forget it. That's not how brains work. And then on the other side, we have in severely traumatic moments, the brain does stop recording memory like a video camera and it starts to take snapshots instead, often with gaps between them. And also when something traumatizing happens to you and you don't know that that's not normal, such as growing up in a household where people are mean to you constantly or hit you constantly, you're not going to think about it in a way that would, like you would look back on a car crash or something else like that, that it's like, wow, that was traumatizing, you know? So I sit in the middle of those two things because yes, a lot of times we do have memories from events that we feel like we've forgotten because they're snapshots that are hard to retrieve, or they're things we thought of as normal, so we didn't think about them a lot, so they're fundamentally less connected in regards to neurons, to other neurons, to be able to like get those memories and use them regularly, so they are harder to find. And those don't come up for us a lot, which is a normal thing that happens. And like we may forget about them, not think about them, and then something random makes us be like, oh yeah, oh my gosh, I totally forgot about that. And this is not just for traumatic memories also, this is just the way that memory works. Sometimes we have things that we recorded in real time and then our brain stores them and then we don't really access them very much. And then, you know, we see an outside cue and we're like, oh yeah, and it connects all the dots. For example, I have a friend who I used to work with many years ago, and most of our conversations are, hey, do you remember this weird thing that happened when we were working there that was kind of unhinged? And then there's like, oh my gosh, I totally forgot about that. Absolutely. Do you remember this other thing that bounces off of it? And then we talk about those kind of stuff. That's how memory works. So for me, I feel like it's less of like, you forgot about the thing and more you haven't thought about the thing in a while, or you remember the thing and it impacts your day-to-day life, but you didn't connect the dots between that thing and potentially a trauma response that you have because you didn't realize that the thing that happened to you was not normal or not okay or not your fault or was deeply upsetting to you because everybody told you that it's fine and you should get over it. And I think especially when it comes to trauma, things get really complicated when it comes to development and aging as well, because of how brains process things at different ages and how brains handle memory in general at different ages, because we do prune our neurons more when we're smaller. But anyway, that's not something I feel super qualified or comfortable getting into, so we're not going to, but that's a thing that exists. But the concern of this discussion is that it's a very slippery slope between trying to understand that like, I get really panicky eating around other people. Also growing up, I used to get bullied around being a picky eater. I didn't realize that treating me that way wasn't okay until I saw like a parent talk about how they handle food differently with their kid for the same reason. And now I'm realizing that created a lot of shame in me and about how I eat. And so I'm gonna work on unpacking that so I can work on the struggle of eating around other people versus I get really anxious eating around other people. Did anything traumatic in my life happen that caused that? I don't know. I guess maybe this happened or maybe this happened. I don't know. And then it suddenly starts to feel a bit like we're in the land of Freudian find the forgotten about memory situation that broke up a lot of families over abuse that never actually took place in the 1940s, 50s, 60s. And I'm not sure what tone it came across in van der Kolk's book, but I have seen many reviews talking about their direct concern about how he never discusses the issues of creating false memories in patients via probing, leading questions, or what impact this could have. Now, false memory as a concept is very nuanced. We talked about this in my gaslighting video, in that false memory syndrome was created by a man who was trying to get away with abusing his children, so he claimed that they made it up and it's a mental disorder that they had, and not that he was abusing his children. It's a whole situation. So that kind of false memory, like, oh, you made up that somebody assaulted you, not really a thing, which is why using the term false memory isn't my favorite, but again, this is also tripping me up. So what I'm referring to here in regards to like false memories is more of an inattention memory sort of thing, more specifically with like little t traumas. Like you don't remember every single sentence everybody said to you ever, but some of those sentences may have been really upsetting at the time and completely change your behavior, but you don't remember like who said the thing or what was said. And when looking back trying to find the source of something that seems like a trauma response, you sometimes can put words in people's mouths they never said or accuse them of something maybe somebody else did when you were in the same room together because a specific memory isn't super clear. We're going to talk about this a little bit more later as well. Now, the second discussion around this book is the titular question. Does the body actually keep the score? I wasn't able to find the most solid, unbiased answer as to what he specifically meant by this sentence, so I talked to a couple people via Instagram. Thank you for responding to my story at like 11 o'clock at night. That was silly of me to post then. But we talked about trying to figure out what it seems like he was saying and what he meant by that. And it basically seems like van der Kolk talks about it in kind of two different directions. The first is the link between a history of trauma and physical illness, how the trauma in our mind affects our bodies, and the second one being that the body can hold on to trauma the brain forgot. We may no longer remember why we're instinctively panicking when a certain thing happens, but our body definitely does. I've already addressed the primary criticism of that second idea. The other criticism of that second idea is that this idea refers to a distinct split between the body and the mind, which we know scientifically is not a thing. They're fundamentally interconnected. But I feel like, based on vibes alone, so I could be wrong on this, I feel like van der Kolk knows this and is talking about it more metaphorically in a way that many traumatized people do feel a disconnect between their bodies and their minds, and part of healing is acknowledging that they are interconnected and fundamentally do impact each other, and we need to pay attention to both. Because even as a chronically ill person, that was something that I had to learn growing up. But a better way to look at this, at least for me, is looking at how Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett talks about trauma. She says the brain keeps the score and the body is the scorecard. Because trauma as a concept is rooted in the brain. It's the brain going, hey, this thing was really metabolically expensive. Let me replay that thing over and over again to figure out what happened there so I can protect myself from this threat in a more energy efficient way the next time around. So it gets into the habit of trying to make predictions of the experiences to come ahead so it can be sure to keep you safe, even if in reality that ends up making things about 10 times more difficult and exhausting for you, because it may actually be super off base a lot of the time. That's how brains work sometimes. But with the body being the scorecard, we know that chronic stress causes the dysregulation of a lot of physical things. High levels of stress means higher levels of cortisol, and higher cortisol levels suppress the immune system, which over time, left unregulated, can make things go out of whack, causing things like digestive issues, muscle spasms, inflammation, making you more likely to get ill, all that kind of stuff. This is assumed to be why autoimmune and dysautonomic disorders are so common in people with trauma histories. We also know from research into adverse childhood experiences that people with higher ACE scores are more likely to smoke, drink, become addicted to drugs or alcohol, more likely to have heart disease, cancer, chronic lung disease, even skeletal fractures. This data is kind of contested, given that the ACE questionnaire only gave the options to say yes or no, and many of the adversities in question were subjective and vague, such as like, did people in your family call you names? Which can range from like so many different experiences. The questionnaire is a bit more specific now, but the preliminary research I just mentioned that most people do cite is based on that initial questionnaire, so that is a thing to note. The data could still completely check out, you know, but there's a lot of discussions as to the solid accuracy of that data, especially because it was then used for a sort of trauma causes brain damage, so everybody needs to save the children activist situation that was somewhat divorced from the data to begin with. Again, this is really complicated. A lot of people are angry about it in a lot of different directions, and it's really hard to parse out what is objectively going on here, but those are things. I like objective answers. This video is driving me up the wall. Even if the objective answers hold like significant nuance and confusion between them, this feels like walking through a freaking blizzard. But that brings us into the discussion of the concerns around this so-called cult of trauma. The one that I see most often is that the term trauma is being overused, and that by describing everything from a bad exam in a class to a dog bite to a car crash as trauma undermines the category of people who are really struggling with real trauma. I'm kind of in two camps here. On one level, saying that you're so OCD about needing your desk organized does very much dilute the experiences of people who genuinely struggle with OCD, and often leads people to be like, oh, you're struggling with compulsions? Yeah, I get that. I really need my house to stay clean, which denies some semblance of care and understanding from the person who is struggling, because no, you don't actually get it, right? You don't get it at all. You don't understand what's going on, but thanks for trying. Very similar to when somebody's like, oh, you have chronic migraines? I get it. I got a headache once. And I'm like, those do not equate to each other, but thanks for trying. So the overuse of a clinical term in situations where it does not apply does very much cause problems, because we forget what mental illness looks like. We become somewhat numb to the concepts, and it makes us objectively worse at supporting people who genuinely need a lot of support, and also makes people less likely to take those needs seriously. We're seeing this dilution play out, for example, on social media, where everybody's telling people it's their responsibility to learn how to handle their PTSD triggers and watch all the videos of all the horrors going on in the world, because if you're not looking at it directly, you're a bad person. When for like a lot of people, seeing that stuff is so upsetting that it does make them fundamentally incapable of functioning as a person for long periods of time, which, from an activist perspective, you cannot fight for what is right if you are not alive, literally or metaphorically. So, and yes, we should all be working on debilitating triggers. I've spent the last few years of my life slowly working on being able to handle things that used to shut me down for a week or more, and I've improved immensely, and it has made life so much easier to live. But that does not mean that we can shame people into suddenly doing that right now. And in fact, if we do shame them into doing that, it will probably make it harder for them to work through those things down the line, which I think speaks to how triggers and trauma mean different things to different people, in that some people can just be like, you know what, you're right, and just do that and be fine, and other people it can completely destroy them. And this general lack of understanding across the board of, well, I have this issue and I figured it out, so stop being a baby and sort it out for yourself too, without realizing that like individual experiences with things are different. And also, like, from an activist perspective, can we please stop acting like forced shame and guilt tripping is an effective tool for getting things done? Because we know it's not. We all talk about religious trauma and then we end up preaching the same shame and sin stuff, and I don't know how we ended up here. Now, on the other hand, though, being traumatized by something does not mean that somebody else cannot also be traumatized by something else. And a lot of discussions on the dilution of the term trauma are phrased in the same manner as like, you can't complain about being forced to eat everything on your plate even when you're not hungry because there's starving kids in Africa, which is just a false dichotomy because one thing does not negate the other. Like, for a slightly different example, I was once told that it was inconsiderate of me to consider myself disabled because other people are more disabled than I am, so it's not fair for me to take the term away from them. which is not how that works. It's not like the population of disabled people is limited to 25 people and I'm taking a slot away from somebody else who needs it more. Not to mention that everybody experiences things very differently. Like when I look back on my abusive relationship, what I consider to be little t traumas from that experience are big T traumas for other people. And that does not mean that they're more sensitive or I'm less sensitive or I'm any more affected or traumatized than they are. It's just a different experience, and that is okay, and it doesn't matter. Also, trauma is really as common as it seems to be. I talk about this a lot in education because we know that trauma-informed practices do help everybody. We also know that younger generations are statistically showing more signs of trauma than earlier generations because of the 24-hour news cycle, growing up in a post-9/11 America where our country has always been at war, being handed deeply unregulated social media platforms that have exacerbated the surveillance state, and obviously missed massive chunks of important developmental time due to the pandemic. I think it's complicated because we didn't really measure trauma with other generations, so like, do we actually know? But still, I don't know. I was discussing this with a friend recently. We were talking about how our generation specifically was raised aggressively and hypervigilant. Like, you can't go outside by yourself. You need to plan what to do in case of a school shooting. You should be wary of the gifts that your neighbors give you because what if they drug something? You never know. We have to check our Halloween candy for needles or tampering. And also the fact that our generation has been told since we're very young that like we're gonna be the ones to save the world and we make the best activists and we all feel like a whole lot of pressure to be those famous activists of our generation who are like 16 years old speaking in front of the UN, which is a lot to put on actual children. And then with the pandemic, we also added like even more fear of the other and a need to be individually responsible for your health and safety that definitely furthered this hypervigilance and fear of the other and divide between people. Now, van der Kolk has spoken about how he does not at all think the pandemic was a collective trauma, and that's a silly thing to say. But if you ask literally any clinician or teacher right now, they will fundamentally disagree with that statement, as do I, because our kids and our young adults are a mess. And frankly, our adults are also a mess. We also all very much experience trauma as a result of structural violence, built-in racism, sexism, ableism, anti-Semitism, other isms I can't think of right now. These are all inherently traumatizing systems that impact how we interact with the world. And so, while many clinicians do talk about the fact that the majority of people who experience traumatic events don't develop post-traumatic stress disorder, I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding and disconnect between people don't develop PTSD from trauma, so they must be handling it well, and everybody is struggling and deserves care and support. The disorder is just the extreme side of it, but we shouldn't only care about trauma when it's bad enough to warrant a diagnosis. And there's also privilege there. We know that people who experience childhood trauma are more vulnerable to PTSD from other things later in life. And we know that strong support networks impact recovery from a traumatic event. So if somebody is vulnerable because they're a child or vulnerable because they're alone, that traumatic event removed autonomy from them, they don't have a strong community, they're multiply marginalized, they're going to be more at risk here. And multiply marginalized people are also the ones who are most likely to be let down by the mental health system. So I wonder if maybe the data on most people who are traumatized don't develop PTSD might be a bit skewed, or at least like privileged to begin with. So on some level, I think it's important that we are talking about trauma more. The fact that people are turning to the internet for support with their mental health is a symptom of a much wider problem. And if making things more accessible and talking about these things more is helping people learn and understand what happened to them through a new lens and no longer feel like they're wrong or broken or crazy, and then find the tools to make their lives easier and start their personal growth journey, that is wonderful. That is so important and so crucial. And I am totally on that side that that's what we should be, leaning towards, even though it should not be coming from the internet. But this is the society that we live in. And there's nuance here, right? Like we talked about this in my mental health TikTok video. I'll link it up here. I'm about to run out of cards, so I will put all the things I mentioned in this video in the description as well at the top of my sources. But this is both a good and a bad thing because it is normalizing these concepts. It's taking some semblance of shame out of them and helping people put words to their experiences so they can live the lives they want to live. But on the flip side of that, it also can over-intellectualize and oversimplify things to a semi-concerning degree. Neuroscientific self-help books superimpose order on the messiness of emotions, telling us that looking inside the brain can explain why we feel so out of control. With neat answers come neat solutions, as though we can life hack some of the hardest parts of being a person, grieving our loved ones, grappling with the long effects of trauma, but there is no remedy for the human condition, and implying that it's all in our heads makes our pain seem like a glitch instead of a feature. TikTok specifically seems to want to refer to absolutely everything as a trauma response, and look, It could be that. Your need for everything to be perfect all the time and panicking when it's not perfect could be the case of something traumatic in your upbringing, some value instilled in you a little bit too hard. It could also just be your personality. It could be your current environment. It could be something a workplace encouraged, so you adapted to that. It could be that your best friend growing up was always like 2 points ahead of you in the classroom and you always wanted to beat them in grades, and so you're working really hard, now you're just used to it. It could be a predictable response to your anxiety or your OCD. It could just be how humans are evolved to think. It could be any number of things, some of which might be traumatic for some people, but probably aren't for everybody. And it's tricky, right? Because the concept has kind of expanded so much and is so subjective to an individual that how do you know when something was just a personal hardship, or is just a piece of who you are, or is a conditioned response to something? And at which point have we just like gone back to the original question of psychology, which is whether who we are is in relation to how we're conditioned and constructed by the world around us versus who we naturally are as people. Actually, I'm pausing because I genuinely think the weird emotions and anger and controversy around all of this is just rehashing the nature versus nurture debate. And trauma is caught in the crossfire here, and we're acting like it's about trauma when what we're talking about is not about trauma. We pathologize nature versus nurture is what I'm trying to say, and I'm sorry, that's the smartest thing that I've ever said in my entire life, and I need to just like acknowledge it for a moment. I think this whole argument of trauma boils down to that. Do we think that humans are conditioned by our surroundings to behave the way that we do? Yes. Or do we think that humans are innately built to be the way that we are? Also yes. And does that impact whether we think that can or cannot be worked on, improved upon, and cured even? And therefore, this is also contentious because people's stance on the nature versus nurture debate fundamentally impacts how they see the world, and so a disagreement on this topic feels like a personal attack on a person's understanding of their identity and their selfhood. You know? I'm also like so much less stressed about getting everything right in this video because I now know that it's impossibly subjective. There is no right anyway, okay, sorry. Back to the main point. The TikTok of it all. I like how we went from like existential to TikTok. The thing about social media is that this is less of a problem on YouTube because longer form content leans more towards nuance and factual research and sources than a short form video does. So I guess specifically more TikTok and Instagram is that a lot of people are just engagement farming. We talked about this with my mental health TikTok video. There are some people who genuinely want to help and educate you about things and don't know a ton about the concepts outside of their own personal lived experience. Again, I say this because I used to be that kind of creator. And I'm not saying that's bad, it's just that I've learned a lot since then, and I'm trying to be more factual now than I used to, and more nuanced and expansive of other groups of people and other lived experiences. There are also creators who totally know what they're talking about and they're genuinely being helpful. But then there's also tons of other accounts that are just taking the vaguest possible every single day experience and attributing that to something clinical and feeding that to you so that you will see it, panic, think you have that clinical thing, comment, watch their other videos, bookmark things, send them to your friends, buy their courses. A lot of them are selling things. And also their engagement itself is selling things because a lot of people make money on TikTok, I think. I think that's a thing that's how that works. I'm not part of the TikTok creator program or whatever the heck that's called. I have no idea. But they are deliberately taking simple things that could be explained by any number of things and going, this is a sign you're traumatized in childhood, to get people talking and sharing and saving all of these things. The one example I usually use is the ones that say that if you can tell somebody's emotions based on how they're walking, you therefore had a traumatizing childhood, which like, what if you just pay attention to things? Or what if your sister stomps really obviously when she's angry and anybody with a brain would notice that? Like, it could be so many different things and it's so subjective. And what that does is make you feel like, oh, I didn't realize that. I was traumatized. I need to figure out what that means. I need to process it. I need to take a step away from my surroundings to figure out what happened there. And I'll come back into the world when I'm ready. Which encourages things like individualism and anxiety and hypervigilance and overdramatic has a connotation, but like exaggerated thinking patterns, which aren't super helpful, especially when it comes to maintaining connections and human relationships. There are lots of things that affect our lives significantly, things that change how we see and interact with the world that aren't inherently traumatizing, and reconceptualizing it as a traumatic thing might make it sometimes feel a little bit bigger than it is, which on one level, maybe we do need it to feel that way because we were told that it didn't matter and we should just forget about it, and recontextualizing it in this way is helpful for processing and understanding something and moving on. Like for an example of kind of both sides, I made a video a few weeks ago about the harmful myth of learning styles and how those impact our education system. And I told the story of how in 5th grade we had to tell our teacher our learning styles, and my teacher pulled me into the hallway and said, hey, if you want to learn the way that you say that you learn, you need to be homeschooled. So you need to figure out how to learn the way that everybody else learns. And was that traumatic for me? I would say not really. I didn't experience it as being upsetting at the time. I still kind of don't. Like, I'm mad about it, but I wasn't mad in the moment. But it also, that event completely changed how I approach my education for the rest of my life. And when I remember this story when I was making that video, my brain started to try to recontextualize that as trauma, which made me feel really weird and unsettled. And I was like, oh, do I need to process this? Did this cause actual damage? Did this feel violent to me at the time? I don't remember. I don't think so. I'm not sure. And it was a whole extra weird thing that I didn't need to do, and I found myself getting angry at that teacher who said that thing for traumatizing me, because how dare she do that? But she didn't mean what she did. Sure, it impacted my education, but she also didn't understand what we know now about learning styles, and it's not majorly her fault that that happened. It's she's not the villain here, so I have no reason to turn her into one, but my brain wanted to turn her into a villain. And it was a really weird thought process. But then at the same time, there are other things where something did feel emotionally violent and everybody told me, oh, it doesn't matter, and just get over it and move on. And having the context later to realize that no, that was not okay. That did greatly impact me. It's okay that it impacts me and is a part of the things in my brain that I struggle to fight against every day. That recontextualizing of it helped me to understand what happened a lot better and helped me to feel better about it and more at peace with that thing happening and going, okay, that wasn't okay. And that's fine. And helped me to let it go. So it didn't impact me as much anymore. And I feel like in this video, I'm kind of leaning more heavily toward the issues of the oversaturation in regards to trauma, like the negatives. And I'm not appreciating the importance of it enough in this narrative, because there's more to talk about with the messy nuance of the negative. But it has so many positives. And I think we should be erring on the side of more people getting help than on the other side. But I do think there is some semblance of this thing really impacted my life a lot, so it must have been traumatic, and I just don't remember it that way because I didn't understand it that then, but I know better now, which tends to go on here that I find really interesting. And also kind of concerning because it does create an environment where we go from, oh, they said some not nice things a few times, to, oh, they traumatized me, and as a traumatized person, I have every right to hate that person and go no contact with them immediately because of what they did to me. And a specific critique of The Body Keeps the Score is directly in relation to this, where van der Kolk seems to not understand that people can be both victim and perpetrator. And I feel like a lot of conversations I see in regards to trauma is somewhat weaponizing it, saying I behaved this way because of my trauma response, or oh, this happened because of my trauma response and I tried my best, but I'm the victim here. And not maybe I treated somebody not super well. Maybe they also treated me not super well. Maybe this is really complicated and messy and we both have growing to do. And I feel like I've seen a lot of situations where people lash out at others and then just go oh, it's because I'm traumatized and actually you're being ableist by saying that what I did was bad. And then everybody will sympathize with them because they're how dare you trigger them. And those people get frustrated at you for pointing out that maybe everybody's traumatized and being awful to people can exist at the same time and you're still responsible for the harm that you cause. Now, do I think that a lot of the psychologists who talk about this phenomenon as the primary reason for why the term trauma is problematically overused maybe don't actually know anything about how these kinds of interactions actually go down, and also doesn't realize that this is a very small subset of people using the term? Absolutely. But I do think that it is still somewhat a phenomenon that does still exist. It's just less common than I think a lot of people who are anti-expansion of the term trauma are talking about as being this is the thing that happens all the time, when it doesn't. The other concern with the expansion of this term is that we're beginning to pathologize human existence. We talked about this a bit in my video on capitalism and therapy, about how people are saying that having human conversation with friends about tough things is trauma dumping, and so you should talk to a therapist about it instead. And I think we have a strong tendency to want to put everything into little boxes, to find all the words to describe everything so that we can intellectualize it and fix the broken things and continue to move forward. And the language that exists to describe human emotion and mental struggles is inherently mental health language. I would also argue that we live in a culture where your struggles don't matter unless they are diagnostic. The you need a doctor's note to prove the legitimacy of your absence thing has kind of conditioned us all to feel in order to take a break, in order to take stock, work on ourselves, get help, whatever, it needs to be clinical. Otherwise, it's not worth our time, it doesn't count, and we're wasting time. Which further leads us to the situation where we are co-opting medical language to describe things solely so that we can be taken seriously and feel like we are allowed to struggle. We've kind of reached a point where we feel like having a hard time coping with the challenges of life is unnatural and something that we need to go to therapy for. And like, yes, everybody should have a support system and should seek therapeutic care if that's something that they would find helpful for them. But there are all kinds of things and all kinds of directions outside of medicalization that are also just as helpful for our growth as people, like having friends. But the primary concern of all of this, which is the point that's been my primary point from the beginning, is the concept of learned helplessness. Everybody's kind of in a state right now where we feel like everything is terrible and it's bad all the time, and we're seeing it be terrible and bad all the time. And we're also seeing everybody seeming to be having a good time and a great life on social media, and so we feel like we're alone and feeling like everything is bad all the time. We become scared of other people, we feel like the world is out to get us, there's nothing we can do about that, and like our past was traumatic, our present is traumatic, so everything is bad, and the fact that we're struggling means we're broken beyond repair, and everything's just too overwhelming to even try to work on or grow from, so let's just give up. We don't see things getting better. And not only does this lead to lack of care for ourselves, but it also leads us to isolating ourselves and also not really caring for others either. But the thing is, we know that the human brain is kind of silly, and that when you feel an emotion, your brain can only really remember other times you've also felt that emotion, so it does feel like you've always existed in this emotion, even when that is statistically not the case. I don't think it's possible to feel the same emotion all the time forever. But the other thing is that humans are a lot more resilient than we think we are. And this is something to be careful with, because it is very easy to tip this into the bootstraps narrative of like, kids these days are just too sensitive, they need to figure it out. And I don't think that is the case at all, and I want to be clear about that. I think that kids these days are like pointing out that maybe everything doesn't have to suck all the time, and if we complain about it, things can change for the better and are changing for the better. But I will also say that I do think that we are capable of more than we think we are, and we have more autonomy than we think we do. Even if you only get like 1% better every single day, that's 365% better at the end of the year, right? And we know that feeling like we are not okay makes us feel fragile. It makes us feel like maybe it's better to stay in our little safety cocoon until we're ready to leave it, which can very easily become a constant cycle. Things make us really anxious, we don't do that thing, the next time around we feel more anxious about it, so then we don't do it again. Before we know it, we become afraid of every single negative emotion at all, because we feel like we're not able to handle it because we couldn't handle it the other times. And that makes the world feel bigger and scarier, and maybe it's better to just hide and not deal with any emotions at all than it actually is. And then we wonder why we feel so lonely and empty all the time. And I'm not saying that's entirely our fault. Like, the loneliness epidemic is a thing, and meeting people and making friends is really, really, really hard. But I do think we do have a little bit of personal responsibility in this a bit. So it's better to say, maybe I'm not super okay right now, but I can still do scary things anyway. And over time, you'll start to prove to yourself that you can do scary things. And this, bringing back the idea of how trauma responses are just your brain predicting the future to try to keep you safe, you can then start to expand that prediction cycle to include lots of different things. Some experiences maybe didn't go well, sure, that happens, but others did. They did go really well, and things start to become less scary, and you start to branch out and do more things, and you start to see your own personal community web grow and your support system grow as well along this path. Overriding anxiety or trauma or whatever you want to call it is really, really difficult. Believe me, this is something I'm working on right now, so I feel you're like, Sydney, I don't believe you through the screen, whatever, but it is worth it. Like, personal example, I'm autistic agoraphobic with PTSD, living in the biggest city in the United States. I used to shake every time I left my apartment. I only ever talked to my roommate, and now I take the trains all by myself. I can go to the grocery store without panicking. I can go to a show. I see at least one show a week if I can. I'm starting to see 2 now because everything is opening right now, and I feel like everything's gonna close immediately and it's stressing me out. I've made a lot of friends. I have done so many things that I thought were too scary and too impossible for me, but there were things about them that I either wanted or I needed, and so I forced myself to override my systems to do those things because I knew I would thank myself later. And it took me a really long time to be able to do those things without crying or needing a full day to recover, but now they're just a normal part of my life. Mental health isn't the absence of uncomfortable feelings. It's the ability to work through hard things and persist and know when we do need to take time out to rejuvenate. Mental health isn't the absence of emotional distress. It's the ability to work through the hard stuff. It's falling down and getting back up again. The problem with saying it's okay to not be okay is that sometimes we start to believe that we're really not okay, that there's something broken in us. If we take that too far, we start to put up roadblocks to our own healing, optimism, and growth. She adds, so next time you say, I'm not okay, remember the truth is that you're just not okay right now. You are not stuck forever. I forgot to include I included the quote, but I didn't include who was quoted within the quote. Sorry about that. It's from psychotherapist Tracy Dennis Tewari, and I hope I pronounced that right, and my apologies if I did not. But to try to attempt to wrap all of this up into a nice little bow, if that's even possible, I feel like at the end of the day, if a word helps you to understand your lived experience in a way that feels healthy and safe to you and helps you to get to a place of learning and growth to become the person you want to be, awesome, have at it. Just like maybe be mindful when you use it and the impact it may have on you and on others around you. And that goes not just for mental health words, but for literally any word that ever comes out of your mouth. And also be mindful of when other people are using that word to try to get engagement from you or avoid responsibility for things. I think trying to create some definitive "this has all gone too far" or "this is going great" statement makes no sense. And I also think that arguments around this are always going to find their way into nature versus nurture, which has no fundamental answer to begin with, nor will it ever. We will literally never know, and there's no ethical way to find out. And also at that point, we've long left psychology and found ourselves in philosophy, and yet we're trying to act like it's science when it just isn't. It just fundamentally is not. And if we're gonna err on one side or the other, I would rather err on the side of more people getting help than on gatekeeping a category just for the sake of preserving the category, I guess. I don't know what the end goal of this is here. That feels really weird and futile to me. But that being said, I also do think that we are a little bit too comfortable doing everything we can to try to stay comfortable all the time. And I think that might be the undercurrent concern of everybody on either side of this argument. But I would also argue that it's not that we're too sensitive, it's that we are too individualistic, and we're therefore feel like it's our responsibility to personally handle everything by ourselves on our own all the time. And handling everything by yourself on your own all the time is impossible. And it makes it feel like it's too big and too much and we can't do it, because we can't, because that's not how humans are meant to exist. We are meant to be communal beings. But in order to create that support system, that involves doing a lot of scary things, which is, unfortunately, and also fortunately, a muscle. Resilience is not something you have or you don't have. It's something you need to consciously work on all the time by figuring out where your comfort zone is, where your stretch zone is, and where your danger zone is, and then trying to do a whole lot more of that stretch zone stuff. Your comfort zone, always going to be there for if you need it. You can go back to it when you need a break. It always exists, but try to spend more time out in that middle. This is why trauma-informed practices are really effective. They make that clear comfort zone for you so that you can relax enough to enter the stretch zone for a longer period of time without it becoming danger zone where you can't learn because you're too busy panicking. And you can, stay in the middle and really learn and actually exist as a person. They foster resilience. So anybody being like, trauma-informed practices are making special snowflakes who like safe bubble wrap, that's not how they work. They foster resilience, and we know this. I've personally been trying to do something that scares me every month of the year. In February, I went to a bar with my friend and I sang karaoke. Terrifying, but I did it. I had a good time. I made friends, and I've gone back, and it's been great. Also in March, I went to a cocktail hour thing. I walked in and nearly turned right back around and walked out, but I managed to stay and try, and again, ended up having fun and making friends. Turns out, not that scary after all. I also have been trying to consume more media that I fundamentally disagree with, because even though it does stress me out, I think it's taught me a lot about how to be a more critical thinker, and it's helped me solidify how I feel about things, and it's helped me get more comfortable sitting in conflict, which means that I'm thinking more clearly when I'm in conflicting conversations. I've also been reaching out to people and getting coffee with them. That's been scary, but it's been cool. So just trying to do things that scare me and reminding myself that the physiological feeling of anxiety and the physiological feeling of excitement are almost identical has helped me so much. It has helped me minimize stress, headaches. I also now have friends and like career prospects that I wouldn't have had I not gone and done these things. So hopefully I'm proving to you that this is worth it. Hopefully hopefully I have made my point. But I think the cult of trauma is not really a thing. I don't agree with that specific terminology, because if anything, this is the exact same scenario we're seeing with everything in the mental health field. And I think I agree with the idea of the cult of mental health a little bit more, but I still don't know how I feel about that terminology, because a cult implies that it is primarily harmful, mostly pseudoscience, and mostly used to take advantage of people. And I just think that's a willing misunderstanding of the overall situation, a willful misunderstanding, somewhat led by a bit of hubris and I'm smarter than these sheeple, I know better, when they're just as deep in this argument as anybody else is. So they're not, they're engaging in it. But I don't know. Anyway, let me know what you think about all this in the comments, whether you think we're more nature nurture, if we really want to get into that discussion. Let me know what kinds of things scare you that you're gonna go try. Not things that scare you enough to like be genuinely unsafe, things that like scare you a little bit. Stretch zone, we're staying in the stretch zone. Let me know if you have a good pump up song that helps you with that. Mine is What If by Cody Fry. You're welcome, look it up. Talk about whatever you want in comments, do it, it's a good time. But remember to be kind. I think if we learned anything today, everybody is hurting and angry, and this topic cuts to the core of that. So let's learn from it. Let's not do that in our discussions of it. I will be moderating things. And yeah, as always, thank you for listening, thank you for learning. Remember, critical thinking is really sexy, and also it's never too late to start over, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.